Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Hi, Kieran. Good morning to you. Yes, I would imagine it is morning in India. Please feel free to jump on and introduce yourself. Let us know where you're from. Totally get that with time zones and virtual Zooms, people aren't always from San Francisco for the San Francisco Java user group. So, yeah, pretty common these days. Well, great. So my name is Peter Humphrey. I'm your friendly neighborhood jug organizer. We are got a fun program for you tonight. Before we get started, I just want to say thanks to Matt for providing and Okta for providing the live stream. And then thank you to just a couple of our sponsors, Logic 2020. They're a consultancy in Seattle. They do digital transformation projects, IT modernization, all kinds of things. And they are kind enough to fund the Zoom. And then lastly, we're sponsored by my employer, MariaDB. Just curious if you can give me an emoji or a wave or a thumbs up or whatever if you have used MySQL or MariaDB in the past. Hello, Hashem. Hopefully, I'm saying your name right. Hey, Dan Vega. All right, nice. Welcome. Cool. I'm not sure we've ever met in person. Dan is one of those Spring evangelists, and hopefully, Dan is still gainfully employed at Broadcom. And I hope you weren't affected by the layoffs. I've seen a couple people, um, yeah, get hit with that. So hoping you're okay. Hello, Nandan and others. Yeah, so let's see, real quick. If you are around next month, we're going to be doing tailor-made software with Michael Carducci on. Let's see, let me share my screen so you can see what. Or actually, I'll just drop the URL on second thought in the chat. So next month, um, let's see, it's going to be December 20th. Matt Carducci is going to come to talk about software architecture. He's also a bit of a showman. He does some magic and things like that as well. He's kind of a fun guy. So, something to check out. And then come 2024, we've also got an exciting lineup. Yeah, totally, Dan. In fact, you are welcome anytime. You know it. So just hit me up on Twitter if you'd like to speak. I would love to have you. Cool. Yeah, I know there's all kinds of good stuff happening in spring. Next up in January, we're going to have enriching Kafka applications with contextual data and SQL streaming. So that's in January. And then we've got more stuff coming beyond that. I won't bore you with all the upcoming events, but please do check that out. Would love to get your folks get your thoughts on that on those topics. And please, as always, if you want to present at SF Jug, please don't be shy. Ping me. I'm easy to find on Twitter, or you can reach out to me through the meetup.com platform. I am frankly a little less active on Twitter these days than I used to be, but I'll respond eventually. So hit me up on meetup.com or at Peter Humphrey on Twitter with an idea. And I will definitely work with you, especially even if you're a first-time presenter. We'd love to have you. It's so easy to think like, wow, no one's interested in the work I'm doing. Why would anyone want to know about what the project I'm working on at work? That's just not true. So, this can be a great way to get a little more airtime, presentation practice for you, as well as airtime for what you and your company might be doing in open source or otherwise. So really encourage you to submit ideas and reach out. Yeah. Okay. Also, yeah, I guess just last sponsor shout out. Like I said, my employer, MariaDB. Would you give me an emoji or a wave or a thumbs up or something if you have heard of MySQL or MariaDB? And this is a trick question because all of you should have heard of at least MySQL, and maybe some of you aren't familiar with MariaDB. But maybe drop an emoji or a wave or something in the chat if you've used either of those technologies. Cool. All right, great. Well, I am really pumped for our topic tonight. You've all heard a lot about how to break down the monolith over the past decade, right? And microservices and service-oriented architecture and all kinds of stuff. And yeah, exactly. No, done. Yeah, most people I would imagine would know both, but you never know. What I'm really excited about for tonight with Matt is not only Matt a great speaker and very accomplished, in the conference circuit and in his career. But I just think that this is a great topic where we're trying to talk about how to make the front end code, especially for these single page apps that a lot of us have been writing in various JavaScript frameworks. A little more manageable, a little more componentized, a little more like a microservice backend. And I think that is something, at least folks like myself and a lot of I think the Java community, like that's a topic that we don't always touch on. We're always, we're probably on the server side, right? We're not typically thinking, at least when we're thinking in Java, of what's going on in the front end. So I'm really pumped for this one. Yeah, totally. I wouldn't be surprised, Dan, if Matt does have a streaming setup in the VW. It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. So yeah, I think with that, let me introduce Matt and get him going, and I'll be done for the evening, folks. Do add your questions as they happen. I will try to Matt live codes at a rapid pace. But you don't have to save your questions till the end. Post them in the chat, and I will do my best to be a pain in Matt's neck and interrupt him as much as possible while he's live coding with your questions. So bring it on. And with that, Matt, thank you so much for coming tonight. Really appreciate it. It's great to see you. It's been a long time. And I am going to back out and let you take it away with Frontends for Java Microservices.
All right. Thank you, sir. So hello, everyone. Welcome to Frontends for Java Microservices. I do want to encourage you to ask questions because I think live streams like this are a lot more fun when there's interaction with the audience. So there will be times during this presentation that I'm running a process and it takes 20 or 30 seconds or something like that. So there will be time for Peter to come back and ask those questions. So I encourage you to post them, and he'll basically ask me during the stream. So I do have an incentive, and that is the J Hipster mini book. I will send these out to people if you ask a question that's more than just, can I have a book, right? And I'll try to get them to you. It might be, if you're halfway around the world, it might be a little difficult, but if you're in the US, it should be quick and easy, and Okta will sponsor the shipping. So I encourage you to ask questions. And now a bit about myself. You might be like, well, he looks dressed a little funny. Well, tonight I'm starting out as a old-fashioned Java developer who drinks, a little whiskey. I grew up in the backwoods of Montana with no electricity or no running water, and I actually had to walk 1.5 miles to the bus stop every day. The cool thing was, in the winter, we got to ski. So this picture here shows the cabin I grew up in on the left. The picture, or the cabin on the right, is my dad's sauna business. He actually built a sauna, sold it only to himself, and that was the only one he sold. So Swan Valley Saunas didn't do that well, but he got a second cabin out of it. I live in Denver, Colorado with my beautiful wife, Trish, and awesome kids, Abby and Jack. You can tell this picture is dated because Jack is now 6 inches taller than me. They're both at University of Colorado here in Colorado, so that's pretty awesome. I also have a middle child. His name is Hefe, short for Hefeweizen, because kind of looks like a Hefeweizen. He's from Germany. I bought him off eBay in 2004, and it took me 12 years to make him look like this. I believe Peter mentioned earlier when I was talking with him that he liked the rims. Well, the rims are just an indication of what engine and transmission it has in it, because I put a 911 engine from a Porsche, so it's got 250 horsepower, and it sure is fun to drive. You could also call them an expensive obsession. So if you have a similar obsession with classic Volkswagens, I'd love to talk to you after. Send me an email or hit me up on Twitter or whatever. I work for Okta, and we do users as a software service, but that's a terrible acronym, right? UAS. You could say authorization as a software service, but that's like ass. So, my dad called it Okra for the first couple of years that I worked there, and he's graduated to Okta now. He's still not quite at Okta. But the term itself means a meteorological measurement. So if it's an 8 octa day, it means there's no sun, and if it's 0 octas, it means there's nothing but sun, not a cloud in the sky. So we bought our biggest competitor a few years ago. I think it's 2.5 years ago now. It closed in May of 2021, Auth0. And I knew it was going to be a good fit when I read about their CEO, Eugenio Pace. And it said on his bio on the Auth0 site when we first, acquired him, in his spare time, he enjoys the outdoors, rowing, riding bikes, spending time with his family, and restoring his 1970 Karmann Ghia. So if you don't know, Karmann Ghia is like a bug or a bus, Volkswagen. And so that was awesome to hear. And we've talked back and forth about his project versus mine. Mine's done. His is barely starting. So I'm a little further along than him. And if you ask, can we scale? Well, there's a chat app out there that we power the authentication for, and they've challenged us to scale, I think 10x in the last year. So yeah, we can scale just fine. So today we're going to talk a brief history of microservices, and then we'll talk about microservices with Java, microservices with JHipster. I'll do an introduction to micro front ends. I'll do a live demo, and then we'll talk a bit about OAuth because Okta's sponsoring it. And I want you to know about what's coming in 2.1, and then I'll give you some action ideas at the end. So let's begin with a brief history of microservices. James Lewis and Martin Fowler, James is on the left, Martin Fowler is on the right in the top there, get a lot of credit for microservices, as did Adrian Cockcroft down in the bottom right there, or bottom left, and Joe Walms. And basically, the first mention of microservices was way back in like 2006 by a guy at Microsoft. But the modern microservices that we kind of know and love today was first like talked about by James Lewis at 33rd Degree in Krakow. I think it's now Devox, Poland. But it was March 2012. And this talk was called Microservices, Java the Unix Way. And Fred George is another guy who had similar ideas at the time. And then Adrian was at Netflix, and he kind of described the architecture as fine-grained SOA. And then he pioneered the style at web scale, as did Joe Walms, Dan North, Evan Botcher, and Graham Tackley. And so the real thing that kind of changed in the Java community, I feel, was Martin Fowler and James Lewis's definitive article just titled Microservices. And that was published March 25th, 2014. So sorry about that. What happened? Play a presentation. There we go. And so years later, this is still considered the definitive article that defines microservices. So remember that date, March 25th, 2014. So in that article, he talks about Conway's Law, and it basically says that an organization that designs a system will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. So this means that if you have UI specialists or middleware specialists or DBAs, like typically those teams are separated along those lines, and even simple changes can lead to a cross-team project taking time and budgetary approval. So a smart team will optimize around what they own, right? Forcing the logic into whatever application they have access to. So this is Conway's Law in action. This means if you're, let's say, a middleware specialist, you're doing Java, and you have to communicate with the DBAs for something, and you don't really want to because you'd rather just, because of your structure, do it in your group. Instead of talking to the DBAs and having them write a stored procedure that makes everything faster, you end up doing it all in Java code. And so it's kind of an inefficient way to operate because, people don't own the whole stack or the whole application. And so microservices is all about doing one thing and doing it well. So, it's often difficult to figure out, what the boundaries are for a microservice, whether it's a nano service or, a bigger service that encapsulates, 6 databases or something like that and brings them all together. But really it's ideally, it's a whole product that a team can take from what they believe, right? So like a product owner, like inventing the whole thing, all the way to production and maintaining it. So if your company doesn't operate like that, where teams can kind of be autonomous and take it all the way from idea to production and then, operations in production, it's going to be very difficult for you to adopt microservices because that's the whole idea behind them, is it makes teams have the ability to own everything from, inception to completion kind of thing. And so, if you're not in that situation, like you might be fighting an uphill battle. So as far as microservices are concerned in Java land, first of all, some of the biggest names in our industry use Java, like Netflix, Amazon, Google, eBay, Twitter, LinkedIn. Like these are major companies doing major traffic, with Java. So obviously we can scale, but implementing a microservices architecture isn't for everyone. And often it isn't needed as far as technology is concerned. The reason you need it is because of people. So when I was at LinkedIn, I worked there from 2007 to 2008. It was about a year and a half. And they had a big problem with people because they did a release every Thursday. And when you have 1,000 engineers trying to merge into the same monolith, that really creates a lot of conflict. So by splitting it into microservices, teams can be autonomous and ship whenever they want, 10 times a day if they want, instead of just waiting for Thursday. So that's the biggest reason that a lot of companies adopt microservices. It also allows, certain teams to use different languages. Like not everyone has to use Java if they don't want to. So the Java ecosystem has some well-established patterns for developing microservice architectures. And if you're familiar with Spring, you'll feel right at home using Spring Boot and Spring Cloud. And I think there's a strong correlation between microservices in Java and Spring Boot and Spring Cloud. And part of that is because of the history of Spring. So if you're old like I am, right? I'm almost 50. We'll be 50 next year. I remember way back in October 2002 when Rod Johnson wrote J2E Design and Development. And I remember reading it, from cover to cover and being like, oh my gosh, this is so much better than what I've learned about how I'm supposed to do enterprise Java, because it was all EJBs. And I had no interest in EJBs. I was more of a front end guy at the time, but I still had an interest in like servlets, and I got into struts and everything like that. And so when I first read his book, I was like, wow, this is great. And so I got very into Spring. I even wrote a book on Spring in 2004, and I started writing it before Spring came out. That was called Spring Live. So Spring was released, 1.0 in 2004, 2006. Along came Spring 2.0 with better XML. It had XSD support, and it was a lot easier to write. But really, by 2008, it became XML hell. And Spring actually had kind of a bad name in Java land because it was so much XML. And guess what? A lot of that time, you didn't change the XML. So there wasn't much reason for writing stuff in XML, right? It was a configuration way of doing things. But if you're not changing anything, then why are you even writing in XML? So in 2009, they came up with Java config, right? And this was also when Java kind of stagnated because we had Java 8, I think it was 2008, 2009, around the same time. But Java, the next version, or I don't know what the sequence is, but it didn't come out till like 2013. There was like a 5-year gap there where there was no new releases of Java. But then Spring Boot 1.0 came out 2014 on April Fool's Day. So bold move. But you might remember March 25th, 2014, that was Martin Fowler's Microservices article, right? So those were within like a week of each other. And then 2015, a year later, there's Spring Cloud, and that's what really kind of took microservices to the Java ecosystem and made it possible for everyone. So Spring Boot, obviously, is one of the most popular frameworks in Java, and I love their logo because it looks like an on-off switch, right? And it's my on-off switch for enterprise Java, and most people that use it, love it. It automatically configures Spring whenever possible. It does the embedded app server thing that a lot of frameworks do nowadays, and it provides configured opinionated starter palms that you can use, and just, you don't have to write a lot of code. And as a developer, you could almost create an app, with just a POM or a Gradle file. And actually, there's little enough code in there that you could do it from memory. And that's not been possible before. So Spring Framework 5 was released in September 2017. And that builds on Reactor and the Reactive Spring specification, and included a new runtime called Spring Webflux. And so Spring 2.0 added Spring Webflux support, and that was released March 1st, 2018. And so when people ask about Spring Webflux versus Spring MVC, what I've heard from the Spring team and people that have used it in production is basically performance differences are negligible unless you are doing a lot of API calls at a scale of at least 500 requests per second. So if you're not doing more than that, then chances are Spring MVC will work fine. If you're doing more than that, then you might be able to save, some CPU cycles or memory cycles by using Spring Webflux. Now with Java 21, we do have virtual threads that kind of changes things a bit, but I still think the reactive model of programming still applies, because even if you're using virtual threads and you have a blocking JDBC driver, like you're still going to have issues, right? And so the reactive programming model kind of makes it so you can have back pressure and better reliability that way. And just to show you some code, we have Spring MVC here. That looks, this is from a JHipster app I wrote. It's very procedural in a sense, right? We're creating a new points object. we're saving it, and then we're saving it in React or Elasticsearch, and then we're just creating a response. And then if you look at the Spring Webflux version, you'll see that it's almost a third more code, and it does like this chaining thing, right? You start with the points repository, you save, and then you flat map it to the search repository, and then you map all that to the response that you send back to the user. So it's a bit difficult to get your head around at first if you're used to the more procedural way or imperative way of programming, because the reactive way is more of like chaining things together. But what I liked about it, learning it, a few years ago, was basically that it kind of exposes you to the Java Streams API, and that's good knowledge to have. And so the difference between these two just, methods is like 14 lines of code versus 22. So, it is almost double, and that's just, formatting. You could put everything on the same lines, but it might look weird. And then, this presentation started off as a different presentation about reactive Java microservices. So you can see here, I published this blog post in 2021 in January, and it was the first time that JHipster had this feature where you could actually generate Webflux, backends for your microservices. So that was pretty exciting. And man, just talking about that makes me feel a little more hip. So I'm going to take off the jacket here, take off my bow tie, or take off. This is actually called an ascot tie. So it's what the old timers used to wear. It's not very fancy, but I feel fancy now. All right. So if you want to see how to generate just plain old microservices with JHipster and Spring Boot, check out this post. So you might be asking yourself now, like, what is JHipster? Maybe you haven't heard of it. Well, it started out as a simple application generator where it generated a Spring Boot backend. And actually, when it first started, it wasn't even Spring Boot. It was just Spring MVC and a Angular JS front end way back then. It was like 2014. And so since then, it's become much more because we have the ability to generate like CI/CD code, right? So you could run it in GitHub Actions or Jenkins. We have the ability to deploy to Kubernetes. We can generate all the files for that. So, it started out as application generator. It's the most popular Yeoman generator out there by a long shot. But we like to call it a platform now because it's a little bit more. And I like to say it's like a choose your own adventure book, but as a tool. So it's a thriving open source project. It was started by Julien Dubois, October 21st, 2013. So 10 years ago was our last anniversary. And the first public release was launched December 7th, 2013. And since then, it's grown quite a bit. 2020, we had 2 million downloads, and we've been close to there ever since. We get like 125,000 per month. And so pretty popular there. So how you use JHipster is there's two ways, or actually three ways. If you're the kind of person that likes visual and using it from a browser, you can actually go to start.jhipster.tech. I'll show you that in a bit, and you can create it similar to start.spring.io. So you're choosing options and selecting stuff, and then clicking download. But the most popular method is using npm, which is kind of weird because it did start as a way for Java developers not to install Node or npm. So I think it's ironic that our default mechanism is npm install -g generator JHipster. And then you can create a directory and cd into it. So most of the time that's make dir cd, but there's a take command in the shell I use zshell omyzsh, and take does that for you. So that's pretty cool. And then you just run JHipster. And so it gives you a bunch of options. I know the screen can be hard to read, but maybe you're on a big monitor and it's not so hard. But it basically prompts you for like a name. It prompts you for, a type application. If you want to do a monolith, it supports that. If you want to do a gateway, you're developing a microservices architecture, or you're developing microservices, you can do those as well. And then Spring MVC or Webflux, authentication type, we support JWT session as well as OAuth. The database type, you can do SQL or NoSQL. The build tool, you can use Maven or Gradle. And web framework, you can use Angular, React, or Vue. And so JHipster Online, I mentioned start.jhipster.tech. We do prompt you to sign in because then you can store your configurations on the site and come back to them later and tweak them. And so that's pretty neat. And then we have JDL Studio as well, which allows you to model what your entities and your apps look like. So this is very handy if you're doing microservices, because otherwise, if you're using the CLI or using start.jhipster.tech, you actually have to go and create each app individually. And this allows you to create multiple apps at once. So this is what I'll be showing you today. And another important part of microservices architectures are Docker and Kubernetes. I'm not going to really go into them too much, but JHipster supports both, and it supports using Console or Eureka for service discovery. And as I mentioned, CI and CD, GitHub Actions, GitLab, all those, it generates them for you. And so what I learned developing JHipster, right? I've been a committer on the project since 2015, is I was always excited about how it had, reactive support and that we could generate, these microservices architectures. But one thing I learned as we're doing this, and it wasn't until like I started hearing about micro front ends, was that we had the UI that's being generated for these microservices is a monolith. And from a microservices point of view, right, it's supposed to be loosely coupled, and it wasn't, right? Because if you have a monolith UI and you change something in one of the microservices that affects the UI, you have to deploy both of those. So not only the UI, but the microservices downstream, right? And so those microservices should be able to be deployed, in isolation without touching the UI. And so it was one of those things that when I first discovered it, I was like, we're kind of doing it wrong, right? We're putting a UI on top of microservices, but we're not, making the whole microservice independent. So this is what it looks like from that perspective, where the Angular app sits on the gateway. And so we added micro front ends, and we added support for them about a year ago, and they allow you to remotely execute and load code at runtime into your microservices UI. So in this case, the gateway is just a shell, and it pulls in the microservices from, microservice 1 or 2, and it's not coupled anymore. So that allows you to actually deploy the microservice and its UI as a single jar, or, as a Docker container or whatever. So Webpack's module federation is one of the best known implementations for micro front ends, and that's what we're using in JHipster. So I'll pause just in case there's any questions and to grab a drink. So similar to the micro front or the microservices article on Martin Fowler's blog, there was a micro front ends article published in June of 2019. So it's been more than 4 years now. But when I first saw it, I was like, this has a lot of parallels with the whole microservices article from 2014. And so it was written by Cam Jackson. And basically, he showed how you can keep your UIs in source control in like separate repositories, even build in testing, and then in production, they're composed into one application. And so for ThoughtWorks in particular, they had in their radar micro front ends as assess way back in November 2016. And then 2017 in November, it was trial. And then April 2019 was adopt. That probably motivated them to write this article, right? A month later or 2 months later. And then 2019 was still an adopt. I haven't looked, recently. It's probably off the radar because a lot of people are using it now. But the key benefits witnessed by ThoughtWorks were smaller, more cohesive and maintainable code bases, more scalable organizations with decoupled and autonomous teams, and the ability to upgrade or even rewrite parts of the application. And what I've heard for a lot of companies is everyone invested so much in Angular JS, and that kind of went out in 2014, that they had these kind of legacy applications as far as spas are concerned, and they wanted to rewrite like parts of them in React or Vue, and micro front ends kind of gave them that ability. Now, I don't know if I'd recommend that, just like I wouldn't recommend having a gateway and, Node and Python and Java apps in your backend. But, it is possible, and some companies did use them in that fashion. So you might be asking, like, why should Java developers care? And just talking about Java makes me feel a little more hip. So I think micro front ends are a fascinating architectural concept, right? Microservices weave everything on the back end together with protocols like HTTP and gRPC. And with micro front ends, it's all HTTP. So you can see your app getting stitched together by watching your browser's network console and seeing remote modules load. So I've encountered quite a few monolith UIs in my time as a consultant, and the backend was always a beautiful, like nice Java architecture. And it was, always tightly coupled on the front end. And so there's a good chance that you as a Java developer don't really care about the UI because you worked on the beautiful backend, right? However, if you consider yourself a Java web developer, which used to be way more popular in like 2005, micro front ends are as revolutionary as HTML5, in my opinion. So I do think, if you call yourself a Java web developer, you should at least learn about them and know how they work. And so now, before I start the demo, I do have a Slido interaction slide. So if you want to join this Slido, you should be able to use your phone, or I don't know how else you'd scan the QR code. You can go to slido.com and enter this number, and I have a couple polls that we'll do. So let me exit full screen here, and then I'm going to go into Chrome. Oh, I got it right here. So we're still sharing the screen, and I can do poll number 1. And what I'm asking is basically, how should we do this demo? I'm going to give you the opportunity to choose what versions of certain libraries that we use. So the first question is, what version of Java should we use? Java 11, Java 17, Java 21, or you really don't care?
This is a trick question.
Well, and the next one actually might change things, so we'll see.
This question is relevant. John wanted to know what whiskey.
Maker's Mark Private Reserve 2023.
Very good. All right, John, I promised you I'd get to that question.
All right, so looks like the answers have stopped rolling in there. We got Java 21 as the number 1 choice, so that's good because I do use SDK Man for everything, but I happen to have Java 21 as the default, so that will work. Let's go to the next one. What version of Spring Boot should we use? 273, 315, 320, or you don't care? 320 did come out, on Thanksgiving Day? So they always like to do releases on holidays. No one wants 2.7. In fact, I don't even know if you can get 2.7 off start.spring.io now, because they have basically, I think, a year and a half before they remove it. So, all right, 3.2.0 seems to be the winner there. We got another one here. Which web framework should we use for micro front ends? Angular, React, or Vue? Now, if it's all Java developers, I'll see a bunch of don't care, but we'll see. People might be excited about the new Angular 17.
You never know.
I'm speaking at a company's developer internal thing in April, and they asked me hey, can you do one of your presentations? And I sent them, and the guy wasn't familiar with my latest presentation, so he was like, can you do the web framework one? And I was like, I haven't done that one in 10 years, but it turns out he wanted Angular for enterprise developers, so I'm creating a new talk next April. So
Web Smackdown was pretty famous, man. I don't know. It's on brand.
Well, it was funny because I did it for 10 years, right? Like, who does a talk for 10 years? All right, so Angular's the choice. And that's all the questions I had, so.
Cough, sorry.
All right, so now we get into demo mode. Let me advance my slide here to the next one. And I'll play this, and then I'll do the demo. So first of all, we're going to create a microservices architecture and micro front ends with JDL, which is JHipster's domain language. That's how we know we're hip, right? We have our own domain language. Then we're going to run the apps and E2E tests with Cypress. And then we'll run everything with Docker Compose. And then we'll switch identity providers because JHipster switches or uses Keycloak by default because it runs in Docker container. You can do it all locally. And, I work for Okta, so we'll switch to Auth0 and show how all that works. So this is the repo on GitHub here, Octadev, Auth0, micro front ends, JHipster example. So there is a blog post for this, and the blog post is for JHipster 7, and I haven't updated it for JHipster 8. So if you were to go to this repo, let me make that a little bigger. This is actually using JHipster 7. And so in this pull request, I updated the demo script for JHipster 8. And if you look at that, like, only real thing that changed is like the prerequisites, right? 11 to 17, node 18 is required, JHipster 8, and then nothing really much else changed, right? And so I am going to use that script, but the links that I have for in the presentation and on speaker deck actually point to the JHipster 7 one. So I do hope to update this soon, but this is the demo script that I'm going to use. And so I'll just put this on the left to start. And then we're going to start by installing JHipster 8. And so you requested that I used, what is it? Java 21, right? So let's make sure we're using that. And then because you requested Spring Boot 3.2, I'm actually using the Spring Boot 3.2 branch of JHipster. And if you requested, a different version or a previous version, I would have just run npm install and installed a different version of JHipster. But Spring Boot 3.2 support is in the main, or in this Spring Boot 3.2 branch in the GitHub repo. The reason we haven't released 8.1 with that is because Spring Cloud hasn't upgraded yet. And so we don't want to do a release with snapshot, milestone repositories and all that in your POM or your Gradle build. So we'll release that when Spring Cloud comes out, which is scheduled for December 5th, next Tuesday. And in the meantime, we'll go into downloads here and we'll do take micro frontends JHipster. And then so what I'm going to do is download this reactive version and the reactive micro frontends version. And so it doesn't matter if you're using Spring Web Flux on the back end. I just wanted to compare my original reactive micro services post and example with the micro frontends one, because the first one was very popular. People liked it, but it had that monolith UI, right? So I want to be able to show you the difference. So JHipster download reactive ms.jdl. And so this downloads from a sample repository that we have and puts it locally. And then I'll do the same thing with mf for micro front ends. And then I'll use IDEA to diff the reactive ms and the reactive mf, just to show you the difference in the JDL between those. What's IntelliJ doing? Oh, it's over here. All right. So you can see, first of all, the first one I used Vue because it was new to JHipster at the time. This one is using React. So everyone wants to change that to Angular. So we'll do that. And then over here, it references the entities that are pulled into the gateway versus here it says, here's the micro front ends and, mentions the microservice names. And so we'll want, and also, for the microservices, because they have a micro front end with them now, you do have to specify the client framework for them. And you can even, have Cypress to test them and make that one Angular 2. They all have to be the same. We don't support using React and Vue and Angular and different ones. And so that's the majority of the difference. Down here, there's some microservices stuff I was able to remove. And then I just added this for fun because, I like to complicate with Kubernetes. So that's the difference between them. Hopefully that saved it. Let's make sure. So we'll cat reactive mf for Angular. Okay, it looks like it's in there. All right, so I actually haven't done this demo with Angular. I like that you chose something other than React. Often people choose React. But this is pretty cool. So if we actually open up IntelliJ, there's one of the people in the IntelliJ team actually wrote a JDL plugin. So if you were to look at it, you can see it actually shows the relationship between all the entities. All right, so that's a JDL feature or a JDL plugin. That's pretty cool. Probably want to close that so it's not trying to index everything as we're creating it. So because we're on StreamYard, this might take a little while, but let's go for it anyway. So JHipster, JDL, reactive MF, and then I'm going to use mono repository, so it actually doesn't do a Git repo for each individual microservice, and workspaces, which is an NPM feature. So the mono repo is actually something you probably wouldn't use normally because, you probably want your microservices and your gateway and all that to be in separate repos. But the mono repository is kind of like having a Maven aggregator POM where it allows you from the, the parent directory of all the microservices to run one npm command, and it does it for all of them. So you can do test, and it'll test all the different apps. You can run, npm run e2e, and it'll do e2e tests for everything. So I forgot to do skip install, but this will save some time down the road. And this is, it's a problem with npm. Like, Maven downloads the internet, but npm like downloads the internet and all its friends, right? And the frustrating thing about npm versus like Maven is you have to do it like, all the time in each individual project. Whereas, with Maven, like it stores them in a separate repo and it versions them, where npm doesn't. So I do think there's a lot of room for innovation in the JavaScript ecosystem to be more like Maven or Gradle, where it actually versions things and you store them outside the project. We just haven't got there yet. And to be honest, npm install should be something you do maybe once a week, right? It's not something you do every day. Me, I do it all the time because I'm testing JHipster, I'm creating sample apps and stuff like that. So my frustration is probably more than most people. But while that's running, we can, start the IntelliJ indexing, because that, sometimes takes a while, and I can kind of show you the structure of each of the apps.
So Matt, one question that Dan Vega had, while you're waiting for things to kind of spool up here, or is this not a good time?
No, it's perfect.
Okay, that's what I thought. All right. So he was like, "Hey, sure, some of this will come out in the course of the talk," and I thought it might. And you kind of alluded to it earlier, but he'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of micro front ends versus gateways. I heard.
So micro
heard
front
you
ends is just UI, right? The gateway is still necessary. You can see here is our application definition for the gateway, right? This is used as Spring Cloud Gateway. And so
Yep.
if you look at the code, it's all Spring Cloud Gateway, but it's built on Spring Boot, right? And so, this is a Spring Boot application. I have to define my Java version here.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking it was like an and as opposed to a versus, but maybe he meant something different by gateway. So Dan, I don't know if you want to clarify, feel free. But yeah, anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the biggest difference is what JHipster does is it packages the front end and the back end, right? And I think there's a lot of companies that do it differently, where the back end, is done by one team and the front end is done by another. But remember, if you're doing microservices, that's not the best way and the most efficient way to do stuff, right? You should have front end people and back end people on the same team so they can be autonomous. So, that's just how JHipster does it. And it's funny because I helped implement the OAuth version that very much relies on like session cookies, right? And then there's a JWT version of JHipster that is completely stateless. And in my experience and in my life, there's all this talk about how you should be stateless to scale. And I worked at LinkedIn and they weren't stateless. Netflix isn't stateless. eBay isn't stateless. Like, people use session cookies and they scale just fine, right? It's the people scaling that's the hard part, not actually the technology scaling. So I think there's a lot of misinformation about, scaling with sessions. And we've proven, at JHipster that you can use Spring Session with Redis and scale across, 10 nodes or whatever you want. So, scaling isn't typically an issue, but, it's a typical looking Java application, right? pom.adoc developer. You have domain objects in here. These are just, the standard ones. If we were to look at, the blog, it's got its own entities, right? Blog post tag that were part of it. And then, if we looked at what store has a product element as well. But this is, this is using MongoDB for the store. And that was on the original JDL, right? If we look back at it, it's got Postgres for the gateway, which actually doesn't need a database. There is an option where you can say no database. Neo4j for the blog, and then MongoDB for the store. And there's no good reason for that, right? I don't think any company would have like a microservices architecture that talks to different databases, right? You probably have DBAs that are really good at Mongo or Oracle or whatever. And so this is just an example to show you, hey, you can do this, but I don't know that I'd recommend it. All right, so that's done. Took 2 minutes, 32 seconds. I'll put this back on the right here and then grab my instructions so I don't miss a step. So we've created that. If you didn't want to modify the JDL, you can actually pass in like client framework options or, use Vue there. So I just want to point that out. And now we're going to go into the gateway, and I'm going to start Docker because we need some Docker services for things to run. So we haven't quite embraced what Spring Boot 3.1 has, whereas if you have a Docker compose file in the root directory, it'll actually use that and start all the services for you. I don't think it'd be hard for us to migrate to that, but right now we have them in a source main Docker. So ls source main Docker, you can see the files. make it a little easier to see. We have Postgres in there, we have console, and then some other ones, but Postgres and console are the only ones that are needed by default. So you can do this Docker compose command over here, but I have shortcuts. So JH console up is one of them. So if you're using omyzsh, you can install a jhipster plugin and then have similar shortcuts. So that'll start up console and then JH keycloak up, and then JH Postgres up, and then we'll Docker PS and make sure all those are running. And then I did want to point out that the Docker resources, you should bump them up because by default they're like 2 and 1 or something like that. So I had issues when I first started, demoing jhipster on stage where it was my laptop didn't have enough memory and like stuff didn't start. Now I'm on an M1 and things are much better. So now we'll start Gradle in this gateway.
And here I thought you were on Windows.
Well, you know what I discovered? So Deepu, one of the leads on jhipster, and I did a Spring Boot and OAuth workshop and OpenID Connect at Devox, and we were blown away because we actually wrote the workshop for like Mac and Linux users. 80% of the people were Windows users. We were like, oh, we didn't expect this. So, I think what you see on Twitter and what you see on LinkedIn can be different from the real world, right?
Right?
And what a lot of developers actually use. Yep. So one of the original reasons for jhipster was so Java developers didn't have to do Node stuff. So you might have noticed here that the build process actually compiled all the TypeScript into JavaScript for us, and we didn't have to do that as a separate step, right? So it's actually doing all that work. And so once that's up and running, let's just make sure, yep, we're using Spring Boot 3.2.0. We can go into 8080 here, sign in, redirects to Keycloak. Let's log in as admin. And then if we look at the entities, you'll see they're failed to load, right? Because we haven't started those services. So the cool thing is, with the old version of or jhipster without micro frontends, because you can still generate a monolith UI if you want, it allows you to click on these, it loads the UI, but then there's a 404 in the back end because it doesn't find it and you get an error like on the list screen. So I think this is better where it doesn't even take you in there. And so we can go into the blog now and start that one. It does have a database, right? Neo4j, so we got to start that first. And then we can run this. And then console is actually running too, so we can look at, what's the status of the different services. And part of the reason I wanted to show this is because with jhipster 7, this actually comes up and says, hey, the gateway is got a green check mark. And I just discovered this like 2 days ago. The gateway is up and running, right? Right here, it's up and running, but console doesn't think it is. So the service check is failing, but the node check is passing. So just want to make you aware of that. There is an issue that I entered for jhipster, and we'll try to figure that out. If you're running it in Docker, as I will show later, everything works. It's just like one of those indicators that, something's not working, but everything is working. So that's why it's weird. And while that's going, we can go into our store directory and just start up the database there as well. So that's Mongo. And so the blog is up and running now, right? These are still saying no, but if we refresh, it now has those blogs in there. So that's, pulling in a new UI from a different microservice. We can, create a new one, admin's blog, assign it to the admin user, and all that's working. So we know the communication with that's working. The store is still not up yet, so let's start that. And the beauty of Apple Silicon is my fan's not even running, right? That's super nice because my old Intel one right about now I'd be like, I give up. And it is funny when I worked at LinkedIn, this is way back in 2008. As a new developer, it was super cool that they gave you a Mac Pro, like a big one, right? And your choice of a 30-inch monitor or two 27-inch monitors and a MacBook Pro. And, as a developer, you're like, sweet, that's so awesome. I get all this hardware. But the Mac Pro was required to run everything because it was a monolith, right? And it had all these background services as well. So, we've come a long way since then that we can do everything, on a laptop, even when we have a lot of things running. So starting up there on the store.
Yeah, I think those new Macs actually allow you to do more than 64 gig of RAM, right? I mean, woohoo!
Oh yeah, think it could go up to 128 now. So we could create a new project like Sangria, right? Maybe we're in a part of the town that's expensive, and then we can even upload an image. And all that's built into JHipster, right? It does the image uploading, and you can look at it and be like, that looks good. So that's how I know I'm a hipster, right? Like Sangria. So that's all working, which is cool. But you've kind of seen how it all works from a standpoint of bringing it together. But what about development? Because is it possible to like just work on the store micro front end, or just work on like the blog micro front end? The good news is there is. So let me show that. If we go into we'll go to the blog here, or let's start with the gateway. We can do npm start, and this will start up browser sync and actually just give you the ability to work on the gateway and modify the gateway, and actually just work with that UI. And so if I look back at my instructions, I have that here where you can run that npm start, starts up on localhost 9000, and then if you modify this home tsx, you'll see the change like right away. So we're going to put this on the left here, and then we'll put IntelliJ on the right and look for that home.tsx. Oh, we're using Angular. Now it's going to challenge me, right? So I got to figure out the other one, home.component, since my instructions are outdated. And what were we going to do? We were going to change this. I'm a quick edit, right? So we'll do right under this H1. We want to get this one foreground. H2. I'm a quick edit. Save that. And down here, should show that, right? We're at 9,000. Oh, didn't work. Man, worked with the other one. Maybe I'm editing the wrong one. Home component, welcome Java hipster. This is your home page. Well, that's how you know it's a real demo, right? Anyone know in the audience? Because this is one of those opportunities where you might have seen something that I didn't. So speak up if you actually saw something. I'm going to go back
And
to
this
my
is
instructions.
definitely one of those opportunities where you could win a free book.
Right. So let's see here. Text primary, does that make it show up? That works with React. So, the beauty of this is by you actually making me use Angular, we found a bug. Or maybe it's just, not in here. But let's try the hard way, right? Because it's really browser sync that's broken here. Let's just try restarting the gateway and see if that's the issue. Because, I got to debug this in real time so I can figure out what's wrong and then enter the issue after the talk. And this shouldn't take too long to start up because, everything's compiled except for that component. And it's possible I'm just modifying the wrong file, which, happens a lot. No, I'm going to guess that it's probably the wrong file. So let's see. Oh, we're in the blog, right? See up there? So that is the issue. We're to cut that. Go to the home
We need to get you a
component.
bigger. We need to get you a bigger monitor so you can fully
Right.
expand paths on your IDE there.
Right. So there it is, right? Now you see I'm a quick edit, and if we remove it, it goes away, right? So in this case, we would expand that. You see there's no entities, right? There's no entity menus. So the cool thing about this is it's just the UI for the gateway, right? And it's not pulling in any of those other ones. So, a better example might be to look at the, what is it? The store. Look at that one, npm start. And this one will be similar where it'll actually be just the store, right? Not the blog and not the gateway. And so here it's all smart enough to start on a different port, still using browser sync. And if we logged in, since we're using single sign-on, it'll already be logged in. I don't know why it's taking so long. Probably Safari or something. Come on, baby. Try again, Safari. All right. Now we're logged in. But the entities is just the product, right? It's not actually any of the other ones. So if we want to make a similar change here, this one is just modifying a div to have BG info as the background. We'll go into the product.html maybe in the store, and then right on this div here, let's add class equals bg info. Now you see that. And I noticed today there's a subtle one. It's a little better, right? A little more subtle. But you can see in real time, right? We're making changes. And even though our backend's running, like our front end with browser sync can make real time changes. So that's pretty slick, I think. And, Spring Boot also has that capability. So thanks to Spring Boot dev tools, if you modify a backend class and recompile it in IntelliJ, or if you're using Eclipse, it does it automatically. It'll actually restart the app as well. So all that's kind of built into JHipster. And then when you're learning concepts like micro front ends, it's helpful to look at the code that makes things work. So let's pull up IntelliJ here again and look at the Webpack configuration for each of them. We'll start with the gateway. And this is often or mostly powered by the module federation plugin from Angular Architects. And so it has these sets up the shared mappings, the shared dependencies, and then with the module federation plugin, it makes all these available to the other apps. And so I knew where it was configured in React, but let me see if I can figure out where it kind of pulls things in Angular. I think it's an app, probably in the layouts, in the navbar maybe, where it pulls everything in. So yeah, the loading the navbar items, right, is in this app core micro front end. So if we were to look at that, this is kind of what pulls in from those remote entries, right? So it's got one for the blog and it's got one for the store, and that's how it pulls those menu items in. And so then if you looked at the Webpack configuration for the blog, you'll see here it's pulling, first of all, it's using all the dependencies from package.json, and then it's got these translation modules that are in the app, but all the other stuff is pulled in from the gateway. That's the shell that holds everything. So if we were to look at like the navbar items here in the blog, you can see that's, the entities that are represented there. And then if we look at the routing in the blog, that's where all the routes are defined. So both of those, as the JavaScript or the, however you want to call it, HTML or whatever, is pulled in, to the shell on the main gateway. And that's how all the micro front end stuff works. So it's pretty slick, once you get it all configured. And then we can build and run it with Docker now. So I'll go ahead and stop all of these. And the first thing you want to do is stop all the Docker containers. So we probably have a bunch running, right? So stop those, put this on the right here, put this on the left, and we'll, because we're using that workspaces thing, we can run this command at the top level. And so if we didn't have the workspaces, you'd have to go into each project and build the Docker container. But I can go to my project here, and I can run npm run java docker. And because I'm on Apple Silicon, I have to have the ARM64 suffix here. Otherwise, it'll build like a Linux one. And because of Rosetta, it'll still start. It'll just start a lot slower. So, if you're building these containers and, shipping them to Docker Hub or using GitHub Actions, then this is the command you want to use. But if you're going to run them locally, then the ARM64 one is what you want to use. And we spit out those instructions, detect your operating system, and tell you that. But it's just something like I like to reiterate because it did take us a little bit to figure that out.
Yeah, a lot of people still aren't on the M1 too. It's like,
Right.
yeah. So, yeah.
And so in the original JDL, if we go back to that, there was a Docker Compose section. So reactive MF down here at the bottom, where it has a deployment for Docker Compose, and it sets up the service discovery, the apps folders that it wants in there, and the Docker repository name. And that simple definition makes it so we don't expand all there's modules in there. This Docker Compose is created, and it has all the gateway, right, and the Postgres for the gateway, the blog, Neo4j for the blog, store with MongoDB. I should have done MariaDB. And correct me, like I've always said MariaDB, but you pronounced it differently. MariaDB?
I think it is MariaDB. Mariah Carey would take issue, but yeah, it is MariaDB. Yep.
Okay. All right, so it's got everything in here, including Keycloak. And once those Docker containers are done, we can basically go into this Docker Compose directory, clear that out, and do Docker Compose up. And it'll start all of those as containers. Oh, I gotta learn how to spell. And you can do -D, but then you miss out on all these pretty colors, right? We can make the fonts a little smaller so it's easier to read. But it's cool that they're all color coded. So you can kind of see things are happening. And then if we were to pull up console here at 8500, oh, we don't want to go to that one, just back to the root. You can see that the store, is turning green. This blog is turning green. They all turn green. So when I run them in Docker, it works. When I run them with Gradle, it doesn't. So that seems to be something that we need to fix. But I don't know if we need to fix it because, as you saw, like everything's working, just console's reporting it wrong. So of course, if we go to localhost 8080, we'll still be able to log in as long as Safari cooperates. Maybe I should use Firefox.
Always a good idea. Oh, by the way, anything that I love the Pac-Man. Anything that works with wait a minute, were those your bow ties that it was eating?
Not mine. Jay Hipster.
Benefits of being a committer.
So what's happening here is this is actually another feature we have, and that's progressive web apps. You can see the title up here is actually Flickr. So what's happening is it's cached a previous version of a JHipster app that I ran on 8080. So I got to go into like privacy and security and clear out my cache somewhere. Clear data. So it gets rid of that PWA that's stuck in my browser.
While you're doing that, I'm just going to say that MariaDB will work with, since it's a fork of MySQL, it will work with anything that generally supports MySQL. So
yeah, and we support it, and we've had issues with like the WebFlux version where we've had to switch between the MySQL like driver and the MariaDB driver, but we've always managed to make it work, somehow, right? And so this is still working. It's a new database, right? So that's why the old one isn't in here, but we can still add our Sangria here, and that's all working. So the next thing I wanted to show you is how to actually switch to a different provider, right? Because we're using Keycloak right now. And so, I like to use Okta or Auth0. And so I'm just going to walk you through the steps because I've actually done most of the work for you. So you'll register and create a regular web application on Auth0, and then, use whatever name you want, select regular web application, click create, use this for the callback URL. And the reason we use OIDC instead of like Okta or Keycloak is because we do allow you to switch providers. And as long as you use this, it doesn't really matter. And Spring Security doesn't care. You have a common logout URL. You save the changes. JHipster expects you to have two roles, role admin and role user. And so you do that. And then to add the roles to the ID token and the access token, that's what this action does in Auth0. And then you can deploy it and drag it to your login flow and everything works. And we also have an Auth0 CLI that allows you to do all this. So you create the app, you create the users, you create the role, you assign it, you create the action, all that. So you can do it with that as well. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create the actual register the application. So I can stop this because we will need to stop it as we reconfigure things. And I'll just do a new window. And first of all, I'll do Auth0 list apps to make sure I don't have it in here, or Auth0 apps lips. Can't talk. Apps list. And you'll see there's a default app. Like these ones are there by default. The other ones are ones that I created. So I'll go ahead and, I don't know what that is. Auth0. Oh, it's dimming my screen. I don't know if you see that, but I got to add more light or it won't. So list or roles.
No, you're good.
List. So you'll see I've already created the roles. And then if I list like actions, you'll see that action for adding the roles is already in there. And I can even do actions like show, I think, and it'll show you the code for it, right? So you can see all that code matches what I showed you. And then if we create Auth0 apps create, it'll go ahead and create that OIDC app on Auth0. And then to configure in one place so it broadcasts it to all the microservices, you can do that in the Docker Compose Central Server Config application.yaml. Let's open that up.
Good question coming in when you have a break.
Yep. Go for it.
Okay. Anbu was asking, so tell me a little bit about state management between two micro front ends. So, for example, you have a product page that's one micro front end, add to cart, another micro front end. How are you like adding, removing items? You know what I mean? And then the info is moving between them.
Yeah, so great question, especially because I haven't done it, right? So I think it's one of those things that maybe you can use a framework, a state management framework that maybe Angular provides or React provides or Vue provides, right? It's going to be specific for your web framework to actually communicate that between them. A lot of times you can use like post message and things like that to communicate between different windows. So maybe that's a way to do it. But, it's kind of like microservices where maybe you shouldn't actually be communicating between them, right? They should be separated. And so micro front ends is similar where, if you want to communicate between them, maybe you're too small, right? It's like a nano front end instead of a micro front end. And, your micro front end should be a little bigger and encapsulate all the stuff that has to communicate with it. But it's a great question. And a lot of the examples actually have it. So I just haven't explored it with JHipster, but there's one example I saw, I think, it's single spa or something like that. There's one of the micro front ends out there, and even the micro front ends article from Martin Fowler shows like a page having different micro front ends in it, right? So there is like a shopping cart that's one micro front end. There's like the actual store with the items is another one, and then like the payments is another one, right? So it is possible. I just haven't explored it that much. So great question. So now
You ever
that
use
we've
something?
figured out,
You ever use something like Redux, Matt?
yeah, so JHipster has Redux for React in there, and it's probably one of those things that with an hour's worth of work or talking to the right people, because I didn't implement the micro front ends in JHipster. Like it might be possible right now. You just do this, and it works, right? But yeah, Redux we do use for React.
Just curious. Anbu,
So now
hopefully
I think
that answered your Anbu, hopefully that answered your question. You need to clarify or
oh, what I
want to
would
follow up? Let us know.
What I would encourage you to do is either on Stack Overflow or in our issue tracker. Usually, if it's a general question, we prefer Stack Overflow. Go in there and add the question and tag it with JHipster, because a lot of us on the team will get those notifications, and it's a great question. Like we should figure that out, right? Like I think that my answer of decoupling things is good, but the better answer is whatever you want, we should figure out and make it a pattern that people can implement.
That seems
So
worth a
everything,
free book to me.
yeah, totally. All right, so we learned not to use Safari there for some reason. I've been using Safari all day and I haven't had issues, so I don't know what's going on now. But if I click sign in, right, it takes me to Auth0 now. And then if I use my one password, I can get my password here. It's right there, and click continue. It will prompt me for consent. So Keycloak didn't do this. I'm sure you can configure it to do that, but this is the default behavior of a lot of OAuth providers, where it tells the user what's actually happening, right? You're giving your profile and your email, and you're allowing offline access. So this allows you to do refresh tokens, which means you can actually set up, your Auth0 account or whatever. So access tokens expire like in 30 seconds immediately, which is the best way to do security, because you can't revoke access tokens, right? They're good for their lifetime. And so by allowing refresh tokens, they can be much longer lived, and you just get an access token when you need it. And the cool thing about Spring Security is it handles all that for you. Like as long as you're passing in that scope of offline access, you'll get that refresh token. Once it expires, it all works. So it's an awesome feature of Spring Security. And now, everything's the same as before. We're just using a different provider. So I think that's the majority of the script here. Just make sure. Oh, if you're using Okta and you want to use there, SIAM product. Auth0 is pretty much replacing that, but there is a lot of folks that maybe have an Okta Workforce account and they want, the Okta SIAM because it integrates easily with that. Auth0 does too, but we did create an Okta CLI that allows you to do this, and it does everything for you. It creates the roles, it creates the groups claim that comes out, and works great. And then, as I mentioned, there's this Kubernetes stuff that generates all the Kubernetes files that if you had a Kubernetes cluster, you could just kubectl apply to, and it deploys all that to a demo namespace. And so the code, right, is in this repo. If you want jhipster 8, it's in this pull request. I should probably have an updated version of this in the next week or two, as soon as jhipster 8.1 comes out, and then I'll update this associated blog post as well. But none of the code steps changed. It's just the result changed. So you often want to have the result in there. So now back to the presentation. First of all, unmirror here. Oh, that's the wrong one. Where is it? Plays. Separate. Okay. Play my presentation.
Some advanced
all right, so
demo
now
there, man. Good job.
I'm feeling really hip.
Out come the glasses. All right, nice. The home stretch.
Cool. The coolest thing is this whole getup is like $15 on Amazon. I've probably bought 5 of them throughout the years. But if you're securing your microservices, OAuth is one of the recommended ways to do it, because the whole point of OAuth is to kind of make it so you don't actually share credentials, right, in your apps, and your apps don't have access to credentials, right? You're stuffing them in Keycloak or you're stuffing them in Auth0, and these apps don't know anything about the users, which is great from a security perspective, right? There's no credentials. You can't get hacked. Like, sure, your providers can get hacked, but you as an app are not getting hacked. And so in OAuth 2.1, there's a number of recommended improvements, and this is still a draft. It hasn't been ratified or anything like that. But PKCE, which is PKCE, proof key for code exchange, is required for all clients using the authorization code flow. Spring Security has that ability. It doesn't enable it by default, but if you use an R starter, the Okta Spring Boot starter with Spring Boot, we do enable it by default. Redirect URIs must be compared using exact string matches. So this is just trying to be more secure, because some, including Keycloak, will allow you to do asterisks, right, wildcards. And so it's convenient for you as a developer, not great for administration. The implicit grant is omitted because that kind of came out before we had, CORS, or cross-origin resource sharing, in browsers. And so it was a way of getting access tokens and them coming back in your browser's URL. So that's not great if they're in web server logs, right? You don't want access tokens in there. So they're omitting that one. The resource owner password grant is similar. That allows you to actually pass a username and password to log in, which kind of is the whole point of OAuth, to not have that. So I think that was originally added for legacy apps. If you're on Windows 3.1, you can't pop a browser, right? And so that's kind of the reason for it. And they're dropping that. And then, a couple other improvements. But, honestly, like, I don't know if any provider is going to be like, we only implement 2.1, unless there's someone brand new, right? Like, most people are probably going to implement 2.0 and allow their customers to make bad decisions. But, we try to turn off implicit grant by default and, make you turn them on if you actually want them. And so if you're, not that familiar with OAuth or OpenID Connect, I'll just walk you through how it might work. Back in the day, what happened with like Yelp and LinkedIn is, after you would create an account, it would prompt you for your Gmail credentials, right? And my parents would probably still do it, right? They would still enter their credentials in and, move on their way. But on that dialogue, it often said, we're not going to keep your credentials, but there's no proof of that, right? And they would act as you and go get your data. Well, using OAuth and OpenID Connect, you can do the same thing. It's just, acting on your behalf. So Yelp, in this example, you're the resource owner. You click on Connect with Google. It goes to your authorization server. This can be, in this instance, the identity provider is Google, and it'll pass in the redirect. So it knows how to come back to your app, and you'll pass in the scopes. And then you'll get that consent that you saw. It'll come back to your app, and then it'll actually exchange the code for an access token, an ID token. And there's a bug in here. So if you've already seen it, you were on a book, but you'll notice the redirect URI that I passed in, right? Yelp.com/CB is different from the Yelp.com callback that I have down below. So let's just fix that so that never happens again. I'm going to modify the presentation in real time. CB. All right. And that's one of the biggest problems that happens with developers when they start with OAuth is just getting that actual callback right. So that's why I wanted to fix it. And then for JHipster itself, we originally had Zool, right, as our gateway. And when Webflex came out, Zool 1 was blocking. And so we were like, well, we shouldn't be using that anymore, even though there's Zool 2 out from Netflix. Like Spring Cloud didn't support it. They dropped support for it because they wanted to create their own, right? So they created Spring Cloud Gateway. And what we found with JHipster was we had to migrate to it because you can't have a reactive microservices architecture if your gateway is blocking, right? And so we migrated from Zool to Spring Cloud Gateway in JHipster 7, and there was no MVC option with Spring Cloud Gateway at the time. Now, the release that's coming out next week, there will be an MVC option. So you could have MVC on your gateway and your microservices. But right now, you can generate JHipster microservices with Spring MVC, but the gateway will still be reactive. So, that might change, but it's going to have, it's going to take us a while to implement that. The reason I love to show this slide is I implemented this, or I drew this like diagram for one of my presentations or one of my blog posts. And someone actually contacted me from Volkswagen and said, how do you know our architecture? And I'm like, this is the simplest diagram I could have created. And you're saying this is your architecture? Come on, right? So that was kind of funny. But with Spring Cloud Gateway,
little known fact, I think Spring Cloud Gateway was created mostly because Netflix team stopped maintaining Zool. It wasn't I don't think they wanted to create Spring Cloud Gateway. Like, you know what I mean? It was they stopped maintaining. They stopped maintaining it, so it was like, we got to do something here,
right? I mean, we have something similar with JHipster Registry, which uses Eureka versus Console, right? Like we have this Eureka server that we maintain, but Eureka isn't getting a whole lot of commits, but it works great, right? But there's this impression of like it hasn't been maintained, so is it really up to date and stuff like that? So that's why we switched to Console as a default, but we still support both. So the cool thing about Spring Cloud Gateway is to relay an access token as the person logs in to downstream microservices. This is the 5 lines of YAML you need. Now, if you were smart and use properties, it's 1 line, right? And actually, YAML supports the ability to put this all in 1 line, so maybe I should change it to that. But it's very trivial, it's very easy to do, which makes it nice. And you might be wondering, like, should I really use the same access token that the person logged in with to talk to the microservice? The advantage of doing that is actually you could get the identity information down in the microservice. So OAuth and OpenID Connect do have this /userinfo endpoint that you can talk to. So in that microservice, you could talk to it and get the identity. But if you need no identity down those microservices, you could have, maybe a client credentials grant between your gateway and your microservices, and then there would be no identity there. And so I did write a blog post just to show how to use Spring Cloud Gateway, with a simple microservice, this, car service that returns electric Volkswagens, because I'm a Volkswagen guy and I'm hyped on the ID buzz. So very simple, kind of shows you, the nitty gritty details. I wrote this and then I went and implemented it in JHipster. So it was, my proving ground for that. And of course, everything I talked about today is in this blog post, Micro Frontends for Java Microservices. And, because we talked about security, I got to put on my Okta shirt now here. Hopefully it doesn't knock out my earphones. We'll see. So one of my favorite shirts that we ever created, little Star Wars theme. And, that blog post, right, this Micro Frontends for Java Microservices, I showed you the difference between the JDLs, so if you wanted to compare the monolith UI with the Micro Frontends version, you can check that out. And I augmented it to show how to deploy it to Google Cloud as well. So if you want to see more about Kubernetes and our support for that, check that one out. And then JHipster is part of the dev community. So we have blog posts on dev.to/JHipster about Kubernetes, microservices with Azure and Cosmos DB, DigitalOcean with Kubernetes, AWS with Amazon Elastic Kubernetes Service, and CI/CD Java microservices with Circle CI and Spinnaker. So that one's pretty cool because it shows how to use Circle CI for automating your CI, and then Spinnaker for automating your deployment. So That was a fun one to write. And then you might be asking, well, we talked about Java. What about Kotlin? So the cool thing is we do have a Kotlin blueprint. And so blueprints are a way for you to override functionality in JHipster, but just part of it, right? You don't want to override the whole thing. You still want, the Angular and React front end. So this allows you to just override the back end. So you install this, and then when you run, JHipster, JDL, whatever, you do -- blueprint Kotlin, and it'll use, Kotlin for the back end. And not just Kotlin, but we have .NET Core. So someone wrote a .NET backend. We have React Native for a React Native front end. We have Ionic for an Ionic front end. We have Nest.js for a Node backend. We have Micronaut and Quarkus for backends. And we even have a Svelte UI if you want to do, Svelte for your front end. So there's some other ones. We have a Spring Native one. So if you want to do GraalVM with JHipster, we are working on that for V8. Hopefully we'll get that out in the next couple of weeks. If you use a Micronaut or Quarkus, that's already built in. There's no special blueprint for that. And then we have a new one that allows you to actually upgrade your JHipster application. So traditionally, we've had this command in JHipster. You can do JHipster upgrade, right? If you're on JHipster 7, you want to migrate to 8, you just type JHipster upgrade. But it's always like part of the release. So it's tough to tell if it's going to work, right? And so we decided to pull that out into a migrate blueprint, which I just tried a couple days ago, and it actually worked. So I'm pumped about that. Might need a little more polishing. It's not on npmjs.org or anything yet, but that's a huge boon, I think, to allow people to upgrade. And how it works is it uses Git, and it creates a new branch and merges them together. So what you're left with is like all your changes in files that are conflicted, right? So you have to go in there and be like, okay, these are the changes I made, put them in there, but it's way easier in creating another app and then doing a diff between them. And there's also JHipster Lite. So one of the complaints that a lot of people have had, both maintainers and users, the maintainers have been like, it's all TypeScript or JavaScript, right? Like, we're Java developers. How do we maintain this generator? It's difficult. And you're probably getting a glare from my glasses, so I'll take that off. So what JHipster Lite is it's just actually managing the dependencies and how the frameworks fit together. So it's actually a Spring Boot app that you start up, and then you say, I want to create, this project in this directory, and I want to use Spring Boot, and I want to use Angular, and then I want to use like Bootstrap, right? And it manages all those dependencies, and then you can actually say, oh, wait, I changed my mind. I want to use React. And you can change it from Angular to React, and it manages all that for you. And it does it using like Git commands and stuff like that. So if you're watching the console, you're like, whoa, it's like integrating and deintegrating and all that. So it doesn't have CRUD ability. It doesn't generate the CRUD entities like JHipster does. It uses a hexagonal architecture and, protects the domain model. But it can be used for microservices. It has OAuth support, and it generates something more modular. And there's currently no micro front ends, but, it does have a lot more momentum from a contributor perspective, but it hasn't quite got as popular with our users. So if you're just looking to like create a shell of an app and you want to use, domain-driven design, check it out. But if you're looking to build more CRUD apps or something like that, then JHipster is the game. So today you learned about microservices, micro front ends, JHipster, and OAuth, and hope you enjoyed it. What's next for JHipster? Spring Boot 3.2, like I said, hopefully we'll get a release out next week when Spring Cloud has their release. That depends on Spring Boot 3.2. We have the JHipster native plugin that makes it so Spring Boot can be in a GraalVM container. And there is a blueprint for that that's being worked on and should be released shortly after we get that Spring 3.2 stuff. I have a personal interest in GraphQL, so maybe we'll create a blueprint for that, or maybe it'll be an option when you're creating an app. But I've had that interest for 2 years and I haven't done anything yet, so who knows? But there is an issue out there, 4251, that tracks the great GraphQL support. And more than anything, you don't have to generate a project to learn from its source. I mean, I would recommend generating a project because it's easier to read the source than reading like the EJS templates and everything. But generate the project and then check out how things are integrated together, right? You can look at how we're doing micro front ends. You can look at how Bootstrap and Angular are, configured, or you can look at how we handle errors that come from the back end. And, all the identity options are there, from JWT to OIDC to session-based. And so it's just a wealth of knowledge. And, before I started working as a developer advocate, I was a consultant, and I would just copy and paste code out of it, right? It's Apache 2 license, so you can use the code in your own apps, and, it works great. And we're also on Open Collective. So we've been very successful in getting donations, both large and small, and currently have a balance of 60 grand. So if you want to contribute to JHipster, a lot of the issues will actually have bug bounties on them, and you can make, usually $100 or $200 or $500. And, you can see their estimated annual budget's 80 grand. So not too bad. We've raised 350 grand over the last 5 years or so. And like I mentioned, JHipster mini book, version 7. Unfortunately, I haven't updated for version 8, but version 8 just came out a month ago. So, it takes a bit to update. I've started it, but, actually having the ability to do the JHipster migrate thing will help me a lot, because I can just migrate the sample app and then update the code and update the book. So I developed a real world app for that, 21 points, that tracks my health. I was inspired by Spring Boot and its actuator, where it tracks the health of a Spring Boot app. So 21 points, you can get 21 points in a week. You get, 3 points a day, 3 times 7, 21. So you get a point if you don't drink. You get a point if you eat well. For me, that's, no sugar. And you get a point if you exercise. So I'm not getting a point because of the whiskey today. But otherwise, I exercised and ate well. So I'll get 2 points. And you can buy it for $20 if you want. You get the print version. Or if you ask a question, you can get one free. Still time for more questions. And you can download from InfoQ there. And because JHipster is a little complicated, I kind of wrote another book that's more bare bones. It should be probably titled Angular and Spring Boot mini book, because it uses Spring Boot a whole lot in the back end. But it's currently at Angular 15 and Spring Boot 3. And I have started updating that one as well. So hopefully I'll get a Angular 17 and Spring Boot 3.2 version out in the next 3 or 4 months. So you can learn more at Spring Boot's guides. There's also, I think, spring.academy is a new site. I'm sure Dan can, put some links in the chat for other ways of learning Spring. Check out Dan's channel. He's a prolific YouTuber and has a lot of tips and guides there. jhipster.tech is where to learn more about JHipster. If you want to learn more about Auth0 and all the cool things you can do, like passkeys where you don't even have passwords, check out developer.auth0.com. And of course, me as an independent, consultant, I used to have Stack Overflow as my lead developer. Now I'm talking to ChatGPT a little more, but still both are very useful. And on developer.auth0 or Okta, we have tons of tutorials on Spring Boot, Helidon, even Micronaut, Quarkus, and JHipster. And the YouTube channel is pretty popular. And we use the same Octadev handle on GitHub and YouTube and Twitter. And you can also subscribe to our Zero Index Developer newsletter. So this is what I recommend because I get credit for it. It's just me and Deepu on the developer advocacy team that do Java. So if you use that a.0.2/NL signup/Java, like we get credit. And you can unsubscribe next week. Just subscribe so we get credit. And that'll, give you tutorials that we write every month, some code samples, and just, stay connected with us. And so my action to you is try JHipster, right? You can install it with npmi-g generate JHipster. If you use that command right now, it'll give you 8.0. If you use it next week, it'll give you 8.1. You can also just clone the repo and run npm install and then npm link. And then you can use it that way if you actually want to use just the main branch. And so I invite you to use the source. And because we're getting towards the end, I got to do my last act here. This is a new beer from New Belgium here in Colorado. It's 4 Roses with a beer. So bourbon, barrel-aged beer. And since I'm a hipster, I open it with a lighter. And so use the source, Luke. That's where the source is. May the auth be with you. And if you have any questions after this, hit me up either on my website, Rabel Designs, on Twitter. You can email me at matt.rabel@Okta. This presentation is already up on SpeakerDeck. You can actually see it right now. I automated the deployment of it. And most of my code these days is on Octadev.
Woo! All right. Amazing. Folks, if you have any questions, now is a great time. Now is an excellent time. And I think we answered one of the most pressing questions about which whiskey was happening. Yeah,
that's and don't tell. Actually, she loves Maker's Mark, so it's her fault.
Don't tell ChatGPT that you're using less Stack Overflow, or excuse me, don't tell Stack Overflow that you're
right.
using ChatGPT. Sorry. Yeah, it is a little bit better for Google search though, isn't it? It's like it's.
Oh yeah, Stack Overflow for sure.
When you don't know what you don't know, it's good. It is a good thing.
Well, I've had bad experiences with both recently, right? Where I spent like hours on Stack Overflow, and then ChatGPT gave me the answer in like 10 minutes, and vice versa, right? Spent a couple hours
Yep.
on ChatGPT, and then Stack Overflow had it. And the best
It,
one I have is I spent hours on both, and then the answer was in Spring Security's documentation. So RTFM before you go to either of them.
RTFM, Matt. Oh my gosh, nice. All right. Well, you would think actually that if it was in Spring Security's documentation, ChatGPT should have got it.
Right.
You know what I mean? But yeah. All right, folks. Listen. If again, next month, please come back for tailor-made architecture with Michael. Oh, wait a second. Okay, hold on. We got some questions coming in. Excellent. Anbu asks, does JHipster generate micro frontends with different frameworks, like one in Angular and one in React? And I'm pretty sure the answer is yes to that one.
No, the
No?
answer is no. Nope.
Oh, great. Love being wrong.
Nope. We
Okay.
don't do that yet. And I don't know if we will, because it seems like it'd really complicate things.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? Bring it on, folks. What else we got?
I think at the same time that should be possible, right? But as you kind of see it now, everything's like a full page, right? It's not like, the menu items are from a micro front end, but like I think ideally you can have one page with different micro front ends on them. And we aren't doing anything like that. But in that micro front ends article that's on Martin Fowler's blog, it very much talks about that. So and it was mentioned by ThoughtWorks as a way that they often do migrations from Angular JS is just replacing like this component, with a React component. So I think it should be possible. I just haven't played with it that much.
Sounds good. Getting number of people just saying thanks and offering a few high fives and claps.
But
Yep.
so about some people did ask questions, right? And I do own books. So how do you want to handle that? Should they just contact me, like, and I'll send them books or what?
Shall we drop your, I mean, you've been displaying your contact information for quite a while. So folks, if you, especially if you ask a question, I think Anbu in particular, asked a really great question on the state management front. So
Right.
I think, certainly, please feel free to use any of the contact info you see here on the screen. Do you have a preference, Matt, of how to be contacted, or?
Well, email works too, right? I'm mrable at Gmail, so that same Twitter handle, just Gmail. Mrable on LinkedIn as well. I check them all daily, so use any of them, or just matt.rabel@okta.com.
I'm just gonna drop your mrable at Gmail, right?
Yep.
There you go. Okay. So yeah, folks, if you asked a question, feel free to drop Matt a book request. Fantastic.
And the books are outdated now, right? The JHipster 8 came out, so I got a bunch of them. If anyone wants one, like especially if you're in the US, just email me and I'll get you a copy.
Fantastic. All right. Seems like we're good on questions for the moment, and definitely seeing a bunch of thanks. Cool. All right. Matt, thank you so much for coming tonight. Really great to
Thank
see you.
you.
And fantastic to have you, and just always a pleasure. This is something I've been wanting to learn more about myself. So, and I didn't really fully realize that you were going to use JHipster. So that was an extra level of
Sneaky.
bonus info. I mean, I should have expected it. Actually, now that I think about it, I should have expected it. So, all right. Please come back soon and tell us more about what's going on in the JHipster world. We'd love to have you back anytime. Anytime.
Cool. Great.
All right. Oh, and by the way, I thought Chris Richardson's comment about that Lucas's book on his book on micro frontends was a good read. I think that's a great. We've shown you a number of follow-on resources in the past 5 minutes. I know it's maybe even a little overwhelming, but So come back next month, for tailor-made architecture with Michael Carducci, and then in January, enriching Kafka applications for contextual data and SQL streaming. And then feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to present on SF Java. Hit me up on Twitter or meetup.com. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening. Please be safe. Happy holidays. And thank you so much for your time. Matt, especially yours. Be well.
Thanks.